I've learned in a long life that some folks build a home with a hammer and nails, and some build it with nothing more than patience and a little bit of flour. This is a story about the second kind. It's about a girl, Lillian Hartwell, not yet 20, who traveled 1,000 miles west from Ohio, with her whole life packed into a single valise and one small, carved wooden box. She was promised a new start in a Texas cattle town called Cottonwood Bend, a husband waiting at the end of the line. But promises, you see, have a way of souring under the western sun. The man she came for would take one look at her and see everything she wasn't, leaving her stranded on a dusty platform with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of quiet composure. She did not know, standing there in the wreckage of that promise, that the man who would truly build her a home was already in that town. He wasn't looking for a wife. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a rancher named Silas Blackwood, who had forgotten the sound of laughter in his own kitchen. He wouldn't find her by looking at her face. He would find her because of something she made with her own two hands, something that tasted so much like a memory he'd thought was lost forever, that he would turn the whole town upside down just to find the person who made it. Stay close and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. This story is for anyone who has ever had to start over with nothing but what they could carry. This is a story about a woman who carried her whole life in a small wooden box. Lillian Hartwell stepped down from the train onto the platform at Cottonwood Bend, and the heat hit her like a physical thing. It was a dry, baking heat, the kind that smelled of dust and horses and distant cattle, a world away from the damp, green springs of Ohio she'd left behind. She was 19, though the journey had aged her eyes, and she clutched the handle of her worn leather valise in one hand. In the other, she held a small, dark wooden box, its surface worn smooth with the touch of her mother's hands, and her grandmother's before that. Inside were their recipes, written on cards yellowed with age and spattered with butter stains, the only inheritance she had left. She wore a simple gray traveling dress, practical and sturdy, its hemline already filmed with the fine red dust of Texas. She had spent the last of her money on the train ticket, a gamble on the promises of a man she knew only from 3 carefully worded letters. Mr. Alistair Abernathy, a clerk at the Mercantile, had advertised for a wife, and Lillian, an orphan with no prospects, had answered. He had promised a respectable life, a small home, a place to belong. She scanned the sparse crowd on the platform, cowboys in dusty hats, a few women with parasols, a station master checking his pocket watch. There was no one who looked like the man from the small, stiff photograph he'd sent, no one looking for a girl in a plain gray dress. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself that composure was a virtue. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. The train hissed a final, weary sigh and began to pull away, leaving her in a sudden, profound silence, a solitary figure on a splintered plank platform in a town she did not know. A man finally approached, but he was not Mr. Abernathy. He was thin and reedy, with a nervous habit of worrying the brim of his hat. He cleared his throat, his eyes darting from her face to her valise and back again. "Miss Hartwell?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper against the vastness of the sky. Lillian nodded, her heart giving a small, tight lurch. "I am." The man swallowed. "I'm Mr. Gable, from the telegraph office. Mr. Abernathy. He asked me to give you this." He held out a thin envelope. It was not a welcome. It was a dismissal. Her hands were steady as she took it, her fingers finding the seal. She didn't need to open it right away to know what it contained. She could feel the coldness of it through the paper. But she would not give this nervous little man the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She tucked the letter into her reticule. "Thank you, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice even. "Was there anything else?" He looked relieved, as if he'd expected tears or hysterics. "No, ma'am. That was all." He gave a short, awkward bow and scurried away, melting back into the dusty street. She stood alone for a long moment, the unread letter a lead weight in her pocket. The promise was broken. She had traveled 1,000 miles to be unwanted. She could feel the stares of the few people lingering nearby, their curiosity sharp and unwelcome. She did not cry. Crying was for later. for a place where no one could see. Right now, she needed a plan. She needed a room. She needed to survive this next hour. And then the hour after that. She picked up her valise and the precious wooden box and walked toward the town, each step measured and deliberate, a portrait of a composure she did not feel. She was a ship wrecked on a foreign shore, and she would have to build her own raft. She found a boarding house at the end of the main street. A clean, modest building with a sign that read, "Gable's Rooms for Travelers." A woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron opened the door. She was Martha Gable, the telegraph operator's wife. She recognized Lillian instantly from her husband's description, and a look of profound pity softened her face. "You're the one," she said, her voice gentle. "My husband told me. Come in, child. Come out of that sun." Lillian stepped into the cool, dim hallway, the scent of yeast and beeswax, a balm to her frayed nerves. She explained her situation in plain, unadorned sentences, leaving out the sting of humiliation and focusing only on the practical facts. She had no money for a room, but she was a hard worker. She could cook, clean, mend, anything that was needed. Mrs. Gable listened, nodding, her gaze resting on the girl's steady hands and the determined set of her jaw. She saw not a victim, but a survivor. "You can have the small room at the back," she said finally, "and you can help me in the kitchen. The town social is this Saturday, and the church has asked me to provide the breads and biscuits. I can always use another pair of hands." It was an act of charity, but it was offered as a fair trade, a gift that allowed Lillian to keep her dignity intact. And so, Lillian's new life in Cottonwood Bend began not in the home of a husband, but in the borrowed warmth of a stranger's kitchen. For the next 2 days, she worked. She scrubbed floors, kneaded dough, and peeled potatoes. But when she opened her mother's wooden box and measured out the flour and buttermilk for biscuits, something settled in her. Her hands moved with an inherited grace, following a rhythm they knew by heart. The recipe was simple, a legacy of trial and error passed down on a yellowed card. The resulting biscuits were anything but. They were impossibly light, layered and fluffy, with a golden brown top and a taste of pure, honest comfort. On Saturday evening, Mrs. Gable carried 3 cloth-lined baskets of them to the church social, unaware that she was carrying the instrument of Lillian's fate. Silas Blackwood did not attend town socials. Since his wife, Sarah, had died 3 years prior, he had found no comfort in crowds or pleasantries. His ranch, 5 miles out of town, was his sanctuary and his prison. But his foreman, a grizzled man named Jed, had insisted, "You need to see a human face that ain't mine or a cow's, boss." So Silas went, standing awkwardly at the back of the church hall, a cup of weak coffee in his hand, feeling as out of place as a bull in a flower bed. He was a large man, broad-shouldered from work, his face weathered by the sun and marked by a quiet, abiding grief. He had no appetite for conversation, and less for the food, until someone pressed a plate into his hand. On it, beside a slice of dry ham, sat a biscuit. He ate it without thinking, a purely mechanical act, until the taste registered. It was light as air, rich with buttermilk, and it tasted like home. Not his current empty house, but the home of his memory, of his mother's kitchen, of Sarah's proud smile when she'd pull a perfect batch from the oven. He stopped, mid-chew, a jolt going through him that had nothing to do with hunger. He looked at the half-eaten biscuit in his hand, as if it were a miracle. He ate the other half slowly, deliberately, then walked over to the long trestle table and took another. It was the same, a small, perfect taste of a life he thought he had lost forever. He found Jed by the door. "Who made these biscuits?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Jed shrugged. "Reckon Mrs. Gable did. She always does the baking for these things." Silas nodded, his mind already working. The next morning, he rode into town and went not to the mercantile or the livery, but straight to the boarding house. Mrs. Gable answered his knock, surprised to see the reclusive rancher on her porch. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning. Can I help you?" Silas held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that was at odds with the intensity in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, getting straight to the point. "The biscuits. At the social last night. Did you make them?" A flicker of confusion crossed Mrs. Gable's face, followed by a slow, dawning understanding. She was a good baker, but she knew her own handiwork. Those biscuits had been something else entirely. "No, Mr. Blackwood," she said honestly. "I didn't. They were made by my new helper." Just then, Lillian came into the hallway from the kitchen, a smudge of flour on her cheek, her hands holding a small crate of empty milk bottles. She stopped when she saw the large, imposing man on the porch. Silas's eyes fell on her, then on her flour-dusted hands. He looked from her to Mrs. Gable, and the pieces clicked into place. This was the girl. This slip of a thing who looked like she might be blown away by a strong gust of wind. He had heard the town gossip, of course. The jilted mail-order bride, taken in by the Gables. He had paid it no mind. But now, standing before her, he felt a strange, protective instinct. He saw the composure in her stance, the quiet dignity that had carried her through a public humiliation. He saw the resilience in her clear, steady eyes. He cleared his throat, addressing Lillian directly, his voice softer than he intended. "You made the biscuits?" he asked. Lillian, startled to be the subject of this intense stranger's attention, simply nodded. "Yes, sir, I did." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. "I own the Blackwood Ranch, north of town," he said, the words coming out plain and direct. "I live alone. The place, it needs a woman's hand. I need a housekeeper, someone to cook and clean. I'll pay you a fair wage. You'd have your own room. It's quiet out there, but it's honest work." It wasn't a proposal of marriage. It was a business arrangement, stark and simple. He was offering her a job, a way to earn her own keep, a refuge. He was offering her a choice, when she thought she had none left. Mrs. Gable looked from the solemn rancher to the young woman, her heart swelling with a fierce hope. Lillian looked at the man before her. He wasn't offering pity. He was offering a lifeline, one that she could grasp with her own strength. "When would you need me to start?" she asked, her voice as steady as the hands that had baked the biscuits. The arrangement was settled with a handshake. Silas would return with a wagon the following morning. Lillian spent the rest of the day packing her few belongings back into the valise and helping Mrs. Gable prepare the evening meal, a quiet gratitude passing between the two women. When morning came, Silas was there as promised, his wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. The ride out to the ranch was mostly silent. The landscape unfurled around them, a vast expanse of rolling grasslands under an endless blue sky. It was beautiful and intimidating in its scale. Lillian held her wooden recipe box on her lap, a small, solid piece of her past in this vast, unknown future. The ranch house was just as he'd described it, a simple, sturdy structure of timber and stone, built to withstand the elements. But inside, it was a place devoid of warmth. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light. The furniture was functional, heavy, and covered in a thin layer of neglect. The air was stale with disuse, the silence profound. It was the house of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. Her room was at the back, small and clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the prairie. It was more than she'd had the day before. That afternoon, she began to work. She started in the kitchen. It was the heart of a home, and this one's heart had stopped beating. She scrubbed the cast-iron stove until it gleamed, polished the tarnished cutlery, and washed the windows until the afternoon sun streamed in, bright and clear. She found a sack of flour, sugar, and coffee in the pantry, and by the time Silas came in from the fields at dusk, the house smelled of fresh bread and brewing coffee. He stopped in the doorway, his large frame filling the space, and for a moment, he just stood there, breathing it in. The scent was an echo from another life. He looked around the clean, warm room, at the loaf of bread cooling on a rack, at the table set for one. He'd forgotten what this felt like. Lillian stood by the stove, watching him, her hands wrapped in her apron. "I made some supper," she said quietly. "It'll be ready when you are." He only nodded, his throat tight, and went to wash the dust of the day from his hands. That night, He ate at his own kitchen table for the first time in 3 years. He did not speak, but he ate every last crumb of the bread she had baked. Thus began their quiet cohabitation, a life measured not in conversation, but in small, repeated acts of care. Lillian rose before the sun, the first one to stir in the silent house. She would light the stove, and the smell of coffee would be the first thing Silas registered as he came in from the barn. She learned he liked it strong and black. She would have a hot breakfast ready for him, oatmeal or eggs, and always a plate of fresh biscuits. He never said a word of praise, but he always cleared his plate. He, in turn, began to leave a neatly stacked pile of kindling and chopped wood by the back door every evening, so she would never have to venture out into the cold dark of the morning. He noticed the way she placed a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, a small splash of color in the monochrome world he had built. He saw how she carefully mended a tear in one of his work shirts, the stitches small and even. She was bringing his house back to life, one quiet task at a time. Her mother's wooden recipe box sat on the kitchen counter, and she consulted it daily. It became the source of the flavors that were slowly filling the empty spaces of the house: savory beef stew, apple crumble, cornbread with molasses. One afternoon, while she was airing out the linens in the main bedroom, a room she knew he did not sleep in, she found a small, leather-bound book of poetry on the nightstand. The inscription on the inside cover read, "To my Silas, my heart. Love, Sarah." A faded ribbon marked a page. Lillian closed it gently, a pang of sorrow for this woman she would never know, and for the man whose grief was a silent, palpable presence in every room. She began to understand that she was not just cleaning a house. She was tending to a wound. She never spoke of it, but she started leaving a second plate of biscuits out on the counter at night, a silent offering in the quiet dark. The first crack in their careful arrangement came during a late autumn storm. The wind howled for 2 days straight, rattling the windows and driving sheets of icy rain against the house. Silas had been out since dawn, checking on a newborn calf, and as the hours stretched and the sky grew dark, a knot of worry tightened in Lillian's stomach. She kept the fire banked high, and a pot of stew simmering on the stove. She filled the kettle and set it on to boil, then let it cool, then filled it again, 3 times, waiting. It was well past midnight when he finally stumbled through the back door, soaked to the bone, shivering, his face pale with exhaustion. A deep gash ran along his forearm, sluggishly seeping blood. He had slipped on the wet rocks by the creek bed, he mumbled, his teeth chattering. The calf was safe, back with its mother. Lillian's composure took over. She helped him out of his wet coat and sat him in a chair by the fire. She fetched the basin of warm water she had kept ready, along with clean cloths and a bottle of carbolic. Her hands were gentle but efficient as she cleaned the wound, her touch steady. He flinched but did not pull away, watching her face in the flickering firelight. Her brow was furrowed with concentration, her expression one of pure, uncomplicated concern. She was not his housekeeper in that moment. She was simply a woman caring for an injured man. After she had bandaged his arm, she ladled a bowl of the hot stew and placed it in his hands. He ate, the warmth spreading through his chilled body. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the competent girl who ran his house, but the quiet strength that held her together. "You kept the water warm," he said, his voice raspy. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of an act of care that went beyond her duties. "I was worried," she admitted, her own voice barely a whisper. The storm raged outside, but inside the small, warm kitchen, the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, fragile awareness, a silent acknowledgement that something between them had irrevocably shifted. A few weeks later, long after the storm had passed, and the rhythm of their days had settled back into its quiet pattern, the truth of his past emerged. It happened on a cool evening, the kind that called for a fire. Lillian was polishing the wooden recipe box, the familiar scent of lemon oil and old wood filling the air. Silas sat across the table from her, mending a piece of leather tack, his large hands surprisingly deft. He had been watching her for some time, his gaze thoughtful. "That box," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "It's important to you." Lillian looked up, her hands still on the worn wood. "It was my mother's," she said simply. "It's all I have of her, of my family." He nodded, setting the leather aside. He seemed to come to a decision. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice low and a little rough, as if the words were unused. "She loved to bake. This kitchen, it was her place. The house was always filled with the smell of bread. When she died," he paused, his gaze distant, fixed on a memory only he could see. "When she died, the silence was the worst part. The smells were gone. The warmth was gone. I couldn't stand to be in here. I couldn't stand to eat what I cooked. It all tasted like ash." He looked at her then, his eyes holding a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "The day I tasted your biscuits at the social, it was the first time in 3 years that something tasted like it was supposed to. It tasted like life." He confessed that the Blackwood Ranch wasn't just a modest homestead. It was one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. He had inherited it, built it up with Sarah. After her death, he had let the business run itself, retreating into the shell of the man he had once been. He had offered Lillian a job because he was desperate for that taste of life again. But he had never expected the quiet, steady way she would bring not just the smells and tastes, but the very soul back into his home. She had done it without trying, simply by being herself. She listened, her heart aching for his loss, and for the profound loneliness he had carried for so long. She did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but in the firelit kitchen, it was everything. The choosing, when it came, was as quiet and solid as the man himself. It was not a grand declaration, but a simple, profound statement made in the place where their new life had taken root, the kitchen. It was an early spring morning, the light soft and pale through the clean windows. Lillian was at the counter, her hands dusted with flour, rolling out dough for the day's biscuits. Silas stood by the door, ready to leave for the day's work, but he hadn't moved. He just watched her, his hat in his hands. He watched the efficient, graceful movement of her hands, the dusting of flour on her sleeve, the way a loose strand of her hair caught the morning light. He had watched this same scene every morning for months, but today he saw it differently. He saw the future. He saw a life he wanted, a life he had not dared to hope for. He walked over to the counter, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He stood beside her, so close she could feel the warmth from him. "Lillian," he said, his voice quiet, but clear in the still morning air. She looked up, her hands pausing their work. "I'm not asking you to replace her," he said, and she knew instantly he meant Sarah. "No one could. But this house is alive again because of you. I'm alive again because of you." He reached out and gently took her flour-dusted hand in his large, calloused one. "I'm not asking you to be my housekeeper anymore. I'm asking you to stay, to build a life here, with me." His gaze was steady, honest, holding a question that made her heart beat a sudden, fierce rhythm against her ribs. She thought of the cold platform, of the thin letter of rejection, of the long journey that had brought her here. She had come west, seeking a home, and she had found one, not in the way she'd expected, but in a way that felt truer, deeper. She had built it herself. One biscuit, one mended shirt, one shared silence at a time. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, radiant smile that made her look younger than her 19 years. "The coffee's almost ready," she said softly. "I'll wait," he answered, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. And in those 2 small sentences, everything was promised, and everything was accepted. And so, a home that began with a rejection on a dusty train platform was finally made whole in the warmth of a sunlit kitchen. It's a funny thing how life works. Sometimes the greatest gifts are disguised as our deepest disappointments. Lillian Hartwell came to Cottonwood Bend expecting one life and was handed another. One built not on the flimsy promises of a stranger's letters, but on the solid foundation of shared work, quiet understanding, and the simple, undeniable comfort of a perfect biscuit. She learned that a home isn't four walls and a roof, but the place where someone waits for the coffee to be ready. Silas Blackwood, a man who thought his life was over, learned that a heart can be mended, that joy can take root again in the most barren soil. Their love story wasn't one of lightning bolts or flowery words. It was a quiet, steady flame, tended with care. A love that grew in the spaces between the words, in the shared chores, and the silent meals. It was a love that tasted like buttermilk and hope. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story meant something to you, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe for more tales like this one. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. It's a comfort to know we're all gathered round the same quiet fire, sharing stories in the dark. Until next time, be well.